One of our church members, who is responsible for 11 o'clock service scripture readings, came up to me 3 weeks ago and asked me about the passage today. And he said, Moses, are you sure you're going to read, verses 1 through 44? I printed 3 pages. It's a sermon. I mean, this is a sermon reading just this. And I told him, Bill, I know what I'm doing. So, not a mean way, but I politely said, Bill, I know what I'm doing. Does God know what He's doing? What do you think? Yes, He is, isn't it? The only survivor of the shipwreck washed up in a small uninhabited island. He prayed and prayed. He prayed feverishly for God to rescue him. And every day he scanned the horizon for help. But none seemed forthcoming. Exhausted, he eventually managed to build a little hut to protect him from the elements and to store his possessions. But then one day, after looking for food, he arrived home to find his little hut in flames. The smoke rolling up to the sky. The worst had happened. Everything was lost. He was stung with grief and anger. God, how could you do this to me? He cried out. Early the next day, however, he was awakened by the sound of a ship that was approaching the island. It had come to rescue him. And he asked, how did you know I was here? And we saw your smoke signal. And they replied. Have you been waiting on God for something like the survival in this story? You pray and pray and pray. You pray for good things. You pray for healing. You pray for revival and renewal in your life. You pray for salvation for a loved one, your spouse or your children. You pray for restoration of a marriage and a breakthrough in a relationship. You pray for financial provision, and nothing seems to be happening. And I want you to turn around to the person next to you and say this. When God delays my prayer, it drives me crazy. Just say it. Say it to one another. When you've done everything you know how to do, you've been told by, Jay and me and Sunday school teachers or Wednesday night Bible study, we've done everything. We've learned everything that we know from the Bible, and still God is silent. Satan whispers in your ear, does God really care about you? Does prayer really do any good? Does God really know what He's doing? And how could you respond to these questions? Yes, 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 or yes, no, yes, or no, no, yes. Think about it. Our passage this morning reminds us of how to trust God when what God does doesn't make sense. Sometimes He does things that doesn't make sense at all, and that's why we are crazy about that. So let's find out from the Gospel of John chapter 11. But I just want to tell you that I'm not going to read the whole chapter, okay? A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend is very sick. As our passage, says 11, 1 through 3, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus had a very close relationship with Jesus. And they even said, your beloved, your dear friend is very sick. In fact, Mary was one of the one who anointed feet of Jesus, who poured the expensive perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. And now Lazarus had become ill, and his sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him that the one you love is very sick. The person who is sick is not just ordinary person. It's not just a friend. He's very important to you, Jesus, so you better come. And I taught, 8:15 service, 빨리빨리 in Korean. Can you say 빨리빨리? That means hurry up. Jesus, I want you to be here right now and do something for my brother. They did this because they knew their brothers, their brother Lazarus was a dear friend of Jesus. And also, they had complete faith that Jesus was capable of healing their brother. They might have expected Jesus to put aside all he was doing. I don't care what are you doing at this moment. I don't care where you are right now. Rush to our aid right now. That's how they felt. However, there was a delay. Jesus did not go to Bethany immediately. And Jesus explained to his disciples why he didn't go there immediately. When he heard about Lazarus' sickness, Jesus said to his disciples, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. These verses implies that Jesus chose not to heal Lazarus so that Lazarus would die. But Mary and Martha had no idea why Jesus didn't come to heal their brother immediately. Mary and Martha waited and waited and waited for Jesus coming to rescue their brother. They watched the road for Jesus' appearance, but he didn't come. Hours dragged into anxious days with no sign of Jesus. Imagine how upset and frustrated they were. Where in the world was Jesus? Did he get the message? Did he know the seriousness of the illness? Didn't he care? So what happened to Lazarus? In verse 17, when Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. He missed the funeral. Can you imagine, Jay and I being late in your funeral? Not just being late, 3-4 days after you died, and then we show up and say, I'm sorry for your loss. What does that mean to you? Jesus showed up 4 days after Lazarus had been buried. You can imagine that Mary and Martha were deeply disappointed and must have been extremely frustrated with Jesus. I don't know what to do with Jesus when he shows up. They must have been thinking and saying quietly to each other, I just don't understand. I thought he loved us. Why would he abandon us like this? It seemed that Jesus had abandoned them at the time when they needed him the most. Jesus could have healed Lazarus for sure, but he didn't. And that's why in verse 20, when Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. But Mary stayed in the house. Wow. This is amazing to me. Mary, who sat at Jesus' feet to listening what he says. She doesn't want to miss any words coming out of his mouth. And she stayed in the house. Instead of coming out to meet Jesus, Mary chose to stay away from him. We can only guess what Mary felt at the time. but it was probably a deep sense of sadness, anger, and disappointment, or even betrayal. Martha was also upset when she told Jesus, verse 21. Martha, she's always nice saying this. She never expressed her feeling directly, but she said, 21, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Martha blamed Jesus for being too late to heal her brother Lazarus. If you hadn't delayed, if you were not so late in coming, it's all your fault. Lazarus would not have died. So in verse 22 and 23, but even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. Yes, Martha said, he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day. We see that although Martha was angry at Jesus, but she still believed that Jesus could raise Lazarus from the dead at the last day with other people. But here Martha's response to Jesus' statement shows that her belief about resurrection was very limited. That's why Jesus told Martha in verse 25 and 26, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. Do you believe this, Martha? Jesus put his hands like this to Martha. In my imagination, you don't know who you're talking to. Jesus saying to Martha, Martha, I'm not the resurrection in the future. I am resurrection. I am the resurrection and I am the life. What he's saying is here, Jesus declared that the resurrection is not a future event. But many people believe that it is future event. Yes, it is. It depends how you look at that. From Jesus' point of view, resurrection is not a future event. He claimed to be the resurrection itself, to be the one through whom all things receive life. Martha, I am the resurrection. You know how frustrated Jesus was with Martha here? Martha, can't you understand? You're talking to the resurrection. You're talking to the life, the source of life. Resurrection, guess, is power from me, not the other way around. Let me ask you some questions. If Jesus was the resurrection and the life, what could Jesus do for Mary and Martha? What could Jesus do for them? Was it really too late to resolve the situation? How did Jesus respond to Mary and Martha's sadness and anger? I don't want to go in there to deal with this, ladies. But Jesus did, and Jesus went to the tomb. So when Jesus arrived at the tomb, he did two things. First, verse 35, it's not in our screen. I don't think so. Yeah. Verse 35, Jesus wept. That's it. He didn't say much, just he wept. He cried. The shortest verse in the Bible gave Mary and Martha such a great comfort. They saw Jesus wept. Oh, I thought Jesus is cold-hearted and he's not going to cry over my brother's death. But Jesus, like we are, he wept. Jesus saying, I know Martha, I know Mary, what you've been going through last 4 days. I know I'm late. I understand I disappoint you. I understand you were very disappointed and then frustrated by me I'm convinced that in that moment, Jesus, who was the resurrection and the source of life, was feeling Mary and Martha's grief, their sense of hopelessness, their pain and loss. That's why Jesus cried. Here's the second thing Jesus did. And as he promised in verse 4, Lazarus' death will not end in death. And Jesus, 43 and 44, then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out! And the dead man came out. Lazarus' story did not end with his death. As the resurrection and the life, Jesus called Lazarus out of the tomb. Mary and Martha thought Jesus had come too late to help, and all their hopes seemed lost. But Jesus wasn't too late. He knew what he was doing. He was just using Lazarus' situation to glorify God. He could have healed Lazarus early on, but he wanted to do something greater than that. Brothers and sisters, have you ever been disappointed or frustrated like Mary and Martha because of God's delay in answering your prayer? Maybe you have walked with the Lord and then consider yourself close to Him. You feel that you are so close to Jesus right now, and yet you feel disappointed because God did not come through for you at your time of need. Maybe you have prayed and even fasted, yet your spouse or child is still not in Christ. You have served God faithfully, yet you are still struggling to put food on the table and pay the house rent. Been there and done there, right? Done this. You have been sharing the gospel faithfully and praying for the sick, and God heals them, yet at home your spouse or child is sick. You have done your best to walk closely with God, yet you are still jobless, or a close relative still died after fasting and prayer. Did I cover you, most of you here? Now I'm talking to myself too. Like Mary and Martha, you tend to feel like God does not care. You tend to feel like God doesn't know what He's doing. Many of you know Esther's recent mammogram and ultrasound showed that she has a lump in her breast. When she called me from the hospital, I didn't go with her because she came back from New Jersey that day in the airport, and then she went to have this mammogram and ultrasound. So I didn't go with her, and then she called me, and she told me that Moses, they found something. It's bigger than 4 years ago. And I don't know what I said to her at the moment. Maybe I was silent for a few seconds. And then finally, she's having MRI tomorrow to find out. It'll be black and white tomorrow, for sure. Waiting surely was the worst part, for us. But finally, she's going to find out what it is. When bad things happen to others and to you in our church, I prayed for you and for them, and I often reminded you of God's promises in the Bible. Your bad situation doesn't affect my faith in God. I'm still have great faith in God. But when I found out Esther may have breast cancer, we are not for sure yet anything at this moment. Maybe it can be nothing, okay, tomorrow. But when I found out Esther may have breast cancer, and then I thought about the worst case scenario, it affected my faith in God. And I was afraid and disappointed. As I said earlier, I've been faithful to God, sharing the gospel with many people. And I teach the Bible study all my life. I'm only 48, so all my life doesn't mean much. But, I pray for healing. And many people, God answered my prayer and then your prayers to heal many people in our church. And yet at home, my spouse, my wife is sick. What is this? What is this? I was disappointed. I felt like God has abandoned us. But last 5 weeks, after we found out this, and then last 5 weeks, while waiting for screening MRI and the breast biopsy, God has spoken to Esther and I clearly through your encouraging words, your cards and your phone calls and your gifts, your prayers. God also has helped us to realize that so much of sadness, anger, and disappointment in our lives are due to the fact that we are listening to ourselves instead of talking to ourselves. So while I'm preparing this sermon, I have talked to myself about who God is and what God has done in my life. I'm talking to myself. Esther went through worse than this situation before. She was hospitalized for 7 days, but nobody knew why she was so sick. But God saved her from that moment and gave her complete healing. And I'm talking to myself, Moses, listen for a moment. And I want you to do the same thing to you when you are going through a difficult time in your lives. And I'm talking to myself, Moses, listen for a moment. Does God know what He's doing? Yes. I surely believe that God knows what He's doing. I don't have the full picture of her life. But I know for sure God knows what He's doing. Not only God has a perfect plan for Esther's situation, but also has a perfect timing for the situation, as He always does. So trust, put your hope in God again. I was talking to myself, throughout these weeks. Brothers and sisters, whatever your situation, remember, God is never too late, never too early, but always on time. He has a plan. He knows what He's doing. It might not be your plan, and it might not turn out the way you expect or want, but He will not fail you. He has something greater in mind. Let us learn to wait and not to give up. Even if you have been in the tomb for 4 days or 5 weeks and 5 months and 5 years, He can still raise you from the dead. Just trust Him. I want to share with you 2 scriptures today. We received this from some of you through your cards and emails. And God spoke to us clearly, to Esther and me. And then also in our Wednesday night live, I thought it was for people who are in the class, but it was for me. God helped me to meditate on these words, and especially through Psalm. And then I want to share these 2 passages with you. First one is Jeremiah 29:11. And I want you to put your name in there too also, okay? For I know the plans I have for Esther, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. I'm sorry. plans to give hope and a future. And Psalm 91, verses 14 through 16, the Lord says, I will rescue Esther who loved me. I will protect her who trusts in my name. When Esther called on me, I will answer. I will be with her in trouble. I will rescue and honor her. I will reward her with a long life and give her my salvation. Brothers and sisters, my greatest fear is not she's having cancer or not. My greatest fear is whatever situation we are going in tomorrow, I will not lose him in my sight. I want to put my trust again so I can declare that he will make all things beautiful in his time. I hope and pray that this will be your confession to the Lord this morning. As you come forward for the communion, Lord, I trust you again because you will make all things beautiful in your time. Amen.